Something is happening in silence, not in churches, not in debates, not on stages. It's happening in people's minds. Atheism is growing, not because people suddenly stopped believing, but because something deeper, something older, finally broke. And here's the strange part. It didn't start with anger. It started with a feeling people couldn't name. A feeling that religion didn't expect and definitely couldn't control. If you've ever wondered why more and more people are walking away, not loudly, but quietly, privately, permanently, this video will explain the real reason. And it's not what religious leaders want you to hear. Let's begin. The first crack. It always begins small, almost too small to notice. A question that slips into the back of your mind while you are busy doing something else. A detail you ignored as a child because adults insisted it was sacred. A story you accepted because everyone around you seemed convinced that doubting it was dangerous. Then one day, you revisit that same story with adult eyes, and it suddenly looks different, almost shaky, like a painting you never realized was hanging crooked on the wall. Religions survive by giving answers. They present a world where every mystery has a purpose, and every purpose fits neatly into a divine plan. It feels safe at first. It feels structured, comforting, familiar. But atheism begins the moment those answers stop lining up with the world you actually see. When the explanation feels thinner than the question it is supposed to resolve. When something inside you whispers that the certainty you were promised might not be certainty at all. And here is the part most people never admit, even to themselves. The first crack is not intellectual. It is emotional. It is not about logic or evidence or scientific contradictions. It is about discomfort. A subtle unease that rises from a place you did not know existed. You hear a teaching you have heard 1,000 times, and, for some reason, this time, your body reacts before your mind does. A tiny tightening in the chest. A flicker of doubt that feels like guilt even though you have done nothing wrong. It is the moment you feel, even for a single second, this does not make sense, and maybe it never did. And when that moment comes, something irreversible begins. You cannot force yourself to unfeel it. You cannot go back to the version of yourself who accepted everything without question. That single moment becomes the doorway through which everything else will eventually walk. The collapse of fear-based control. For centuries, religion did not have to prove anything. It did not need evidence or consistency or logic. It only needed to scare you enough to stop you from asking questions. Fear did the heavy lifting. Eternal punishment. A cosmic judge who never slept. Invisible surveillance that watched you even in your most private thoughts. When fear is the leash, obedience looks a lot like faith, and people mistake compliance for conviction. For a long time, that system worked. Fear was inherited the same way people inherited family names and local traditions. It blended into daily life so naturally that no one questioned where it came from or why it had so much power over them. It shaped behavior, created guilt, limited curiosity, and rewarded silence. It taught entire societies to police their own minds. But then something subtle shifted, and the shift spread faster than anyone expected. People started noticing the mechanism behind the fear. They began to see the hand that held the leash. They realized that fear only works when you do not recognize who is benefiting from your obedience. Once you notice the structure behind the threat loses its grip. A person who understands the tool no longer bows to the tool. And the collapse does not happen in a dramatic burst. It does not explode. It does not shatter. It falls apart the way dust slides off an old forgotten statue. Quietly, slowly, almost peacefully. One day, you simply feel lighter, and you realize the weight you carried was never natural. It was placed on you. Here is the key. When fear fades, belief does too. Not instantly, not always loudly, but inevitably, because a belief that only survives through fear was never a belief. It was a prison. And this collapse is only the surface. Something deeper is pushing the shift forward, something even religion cannot contain. The information flood religion couldn't survive. For 2,000 years, religions controlled the story. They decided what was true, what was sacred, and what was forbidden to question. They shaped entire cultures by limiting what people were allowed to know. Information moved slowly, and authority moved quickly, which meant the institution always stayed ahead of the individual. Knowledge traveled through priests, scribes, and tradition keepers who filtered everything before it reached the public. In that world, belief was almost unavoidable. But the world changed. The gatekeepers lost their monopoly. The moment the internet appeared, the story slipped out of their hands. Suddenly, reality became decentralized. A teenager sitting in a small room with an ordinary phone has more access to religious history than entire councils of clergy had in their lifetime. They can read ancient texts, compare translations, study archaeology, examine contradictions, and explore global mythologies that religions once hid behind walls of authority. When young people look at the origins of beliefs without filters, things stand out immediately. They see inconsistencies that were never addressed. They see contradictions that were once waved away with the phrase, mysterious ways. They notice borrowed myths that match older cultures word for word. Practices that were claimed to be unique turn out to be recycled customs. Stories once presented as divine revelation start to resemble repeated folklore. Errors that were protected as holy mysteries now appear like simple editing mistakes. Here is the twist. The internet does not promote atheism. It promotes questions. It encourages curiosity. It invites comparison. It shows the world that no tradition exists in a vacuum. And once someone begins asking questions, the old structures feel less unshakable than they once did. Religions were built to survive faith. They were never built to survive open access to information. They were never built to survive a generation that can verify everything for themselves. The myth of certainty breaks apart. Religions promise absolute truth. They promise clarity in a world that rarely offers any. They present reality as a clean line. Simple, predictable, final. For a long time this felt comforting because certainty feels like safety. When you grow up inside a system that claims to have every answer, you do not feel the need to look beyond it. You feel protected by explanation. But modern people live with uncertainty every single day. We understand that the universe is chaotic. We see randomness in nature and unpredictability in our personal lives. We know that complexity is not an obstacle. It is the natural shape of reality. Science, psychology, biology, all of them reveal layers and contradictions and questions that do not get tied up neatly. We live in a time where it is normal to say, "I do not know yet," and still move forward. So, when religion insists that it has one perfect explanation for everything, in a world where nothing else has perfect explanations, the promise begins to feel artificial. It feels manufactured. It feels like someone trying to sound confident rather than someone offering truth. People start noticing the difference between genuine understanding and forced certainty. This shift does not come from rejection of a divine presence. Most people who leave religion are not rejecting a higher power in the way religious leaders imagine. They are rejecting oversimplification. They are rejecting the idea that an ancient set of rules can map perfectly onto a universe that is massive, evolving, and filled with unknowns. They are rejecting the pressure to pretend that doubt is a flaw instead of a natural part of thinking. Something inside modern minds sees the gap between the complexity of life and the simplicity of doctrine. That gap grows into discomfort. The discomfort becomes suspicion, and the suspicion becomes clarity. And here is the important point. This break in the promise of certainty is powerful, but it is still not the deepest reason atheism is rising. Something much larger is moving beneath the surface. The moral inversion. Here is the contradiction people cannot unsee once they notice it. Religion claims to be the source of morality, while simultaneously excusing behavior that would be condemned anywhere else. It asks you to treat ancient violence as sacred wisdom. It asks you to excuse cruelty because it comes wrapped in holy language. It asks you to call injustice righteous when the text says it is allowed. You see genocide described as the will of a loving creator. You see slavery redefined as historical context instead of brutality. You see cruelty reframed as discipline, as if suffering becomes noble when it serves a divine narrative. You see silence demanded as submission, as if obedience is the highest virtue a human being can offer. At some point, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. People look at these stories with modern eyes, and feel a quiet shock rising inside them. They ask themselves why they are expected to defend something they would never defend in any other situation. They wonder why unquestioned loyalty is praised, when the content of that loyalty contradicts basic human empathy. They notice that the moral compass that guides their daily life is far more compassionate than the one they are told to follow in doctrine. Atheism grows not because people become immoral. It grows because people become more moral than the doctrines they were raised with. They start trusting their own ethical intuition more than the rules that were written in eras defined by conquest and hierarchy. They realize that morality does not come from fear of punishment or hope of reward. It comes from empathy, from responsibility, from understanding the consequences of harm. This moment creates a psychological rupture. A person who sees themselves acting with more kindness and fairness than the God they were taught to worship begins to question everything. The entire structure of inherited belief starts to feel unstable. The foundation shakes. Something internal shifts. And that shift is not just intellectual. It becomes deeply personal. It opens the door to the next transformation, one that reaches into identity itself. Identity without religion. For thousands of years, identity came pre-packaged. You were born into a tribe. You were assigned a role. You were handed a set of beliefs before you even understood what belief was. Everything important about you was decided long before you could speak. You did not choose. You inherited. That was the normal shape of existence. The community decided the narrative, and the individual stepped into it without question. But something changed in the modern mind. People no longer inherit identity by default. They build it. They create it piece by piece. They look at their values, their culture, their personal desires, and they shape a life that reflects who they actually are, rather than who they were told to be. Individuality has become a skill. Self-definition has become a form of power. And once you see this, another realization begins to form. You start to notice that the beliefs you were raised with feel strangely familiar, almost too familiar, like clothing that was placed on you before you could decide if it fit. You begin to sense that your worldview might not be yours at all. It might simply be the first story you were exposed to, repeated so often that it felt like truth. This is where the dangerous question appears. Do I actually believe this, or was I taught to believe it? That single question cuts through inherited identity like a blade through fabric. It reveals how much of your past was shaped by circumstance rather than choice. It reveals how much of your belief system was signed before you ever learned to question anything. That question alone has created millions of atheists. It opens a doorway that cannot be closed again. Once you see how much of your identity was constructed by outside forces, you begin searching for the parts that truly belong to you. But there is an even bigger driver behind this shift. Something deeper than identity. Something that changes not just who you are, but how you understand your relationship to authority itself. The silent generation shift. Older generations were trained to respect authority. They grew up in a world where questioning elders, leaders, or religious figures felt almost unthinkable. Obedience was not just encouraged, it was expected. Stability came from tradition, and tradition came from doing what you were told without pushing too hard on the boundaries. Younger generations were raised in a different atmosphere. They were taught to question authority, to think independently, to explore ideas instead of absorbing them. Schools encouraged debate. Media encouraged analysis. The entire culture shifted toward curiosity as a virtue rather than a threat. This change created a subtle but powerful divide between generations. One generation asked, "What should I believe?" The next asked, "Why should I believe it?" And the newest asks something even more disruptive. They ask, "Why should I believe anything without evidence?" That single shift in thinking transforms the entire landscape of belief. It removes the old assumption that authority is automatically trustworthy. It puts the burden of proof on the claim instead of the listener. Atheism is no longer seen as rebellion. It is not an act of defiance or a dramatic break from tradition. It has become the natural default when explanations do not hold up under scrutiny. If a belief cannot answer questions, it does not survive contact with this new mindset. Silence is no longer persuasive. Fear no longer works. Appeal to tradition no longer convinces anyone who grew up with access to unlimited information. This shift is happening quietly. It is not loud, it is not aggressive. It moves through classrooms, through conversations between friends, through late-night searches online. It spreads through the simple recognition that questioning is not dangerous, it is responsible. And now, we reach the core of everything. The one reason that ties every shift together. The reason identity changes. The reason fear collapses. The reason inherited belief breaks. Something deeper is happening inside the human mind, and it is reshaping everything we thought we understood about faith. The psychological breakthrough. This is the part no one talks about, even though it is the turning point that changes everything. Atheism does not spread because people read more science or watch more debates. Those things help, but they are not the core. Atheism grows because people stop needing permission. They stop needing someone else to tell them who they are, what they should believe, and how they should interpret their own thoughts. They stop seeking validation from an authority above them. They stop craving a cosmic parent who watches over every move and promises protection only if they stay obedient. What emerges in its place is a strange and liberating truth. You do not need a divine plan to live a meaningful life. You do not need eternal reward to be a good person. You do not need fear to stay moral or grounded or responsible. You begin to understand that every value you thought came from religion was actually coming from you. Your empathy, your choices, your willingness to understand others, the strength you carry quietly in your own mind. And then comes the realization that changes everything. You think to yourself, everything I thought I needed from religion, I can create myself. This is the moment belief dissolves. Not because someone argued you into a corner, and not because you suddenly became hostile toward faith. It dissolves because you discovered you already had the tools religion claimed to offer: purpose, morality, accountability, courage, compassion. These things were never delivered from the outside. They were built from within. The shift is not violent. It is not dramatic. It does not arrive with anger or celebration. It arrives quietly, almost like a soft click inside the mind. A door opens, and you realize you are free to walk through without asking for approval. And once you step through that door, everything that follows becomes obvious. The beliefs that once held you feel smaller. The fear that once controlled you feels unnecessary. The world becomes larger, and you finally understand that your life was always your own. The real reason. So what is the real reason atheism is growing? After all the history, the psychology, the social shifts, what is the single thread that pulls everything together? It is simpler than anyone expects, yet powerful enough to reshape entire cultures. People finally trust their own minds. They trust their ability to think. They trust their natural sense of curiosity. They trust the voice inside them that says, "Wait a moment, this does not match what I see." And that trust changes everything. People now trust evidence. They trust reason. They trust the process of asking a question and finding an answer that holds up in reality, instead of relying on an explanation that cannot be checked. They trust themselves more than ancient stories written by men who did not know what electricity was, who had never seen the night sky through a telescope, who believed illness came from invisible spirits rather than biology. When someone recognizes that their own mind is capable of understanding the world, the dependency on religious authority begins to dissolve, not in anger, but in clarity. The real reason atheism is growing is this. Human confidence is rising faster than religious authority can maintain control. People feel more capable, more self-directed, more comfortable standing on their own mental feet. They are not losing faith in the sense religious leaders fear. They are reclaiming autonomy. They are reclaiming the right to decide what makes sense and what does not. They are reclaiming the ability to question without guilt. They are stepping out of frameworks designed to shape their thoughts before they even formed opinions of their own. And once someone experiences that kind of freedom, it becomes almost impossible to return to a life where their inner world is dictated by external rules. Once you taste that freedom, you do not go back. You cannot unlearn it. You cannot pretend you need something you have already outgrown. The mind moves forward, and the rest of the world eventually follows. So where does this leave us? In a world where more and more people are choosing reality over ritual, questions over fear, responsibility over obedience. Atheism isn't a rebellion anymore. It's a sign of maturity. a sign that humanity is finally growing into its own mind. And if you're watching this, something inside you knows that. You're part of this shift, part of this awakening, part of this moment where we stop outsourcing truth and start building it ourselves. So, if you value clarity over comfort, reason over tradition, and truth over fear, subscribe, stay curious, and keep questioning what you were taught. Because the future belongs to the minds that think for themselves.